hello to everybody at home or wherever you might be. Thank you for joining us tonight. I also want to thank my colleagues over here, Keith and Vrico, for their leadership with Reef Check Hong Kong, which is an incredible effort spanning more than 25 years now for bringing you out to the reef to see the condition of our corals here and the remarkable diversity that they support. You know, right now it's a time in our society and our lives where it's kind of easy to get depressed and lose our optimism, especially when it comes to environmental issues. But we see now Hong Kongers going outside as much as they can to escape the hustle and bustle of the city. And we need to harness that energy and that enthusiasm that you all are bringing to the city and focusing that energy on the wonderful biodiversity we have here. So I'm very, very happy to be able to share some of my optimism for our local coral communities as you embark on going out and checking on them with AFCD and Reef Check support. So tonight I've been asked to talk again about some of the history of Hong Kong's coral communities. There's a rich history that underpins all of our natural areas, and for the marine environment, the coral communities have an equally rich and interesting history because Hong Kong was once a much wilder place. And one thing I often dream about is how we might be able to make Hong Kong wild again, and we have this wonderful vision of a future of Hong Kong that is still green, and maybe the waters are a bit clearer, and we have abundant wildlife that we can enjoy in a new green economy. And this is really important not only for economics, but also for the fate of our planet. If you look at this figure, these are the planetary boundaries. The inner green sphere is where we should be in order to live on a sustainable Earth. And where you see those red lines, those are important areas or problem areas where we have far exceeded the limits that Earth can sustain. And when we look at this figure, we can see that relative to other problems that we often hear about in the news, even climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, what's screaming at us very clearly from this figure is that the loss of biodiversity is the worst crisis we're facing as the human species. And one of the reasons for that loss of biodiversity is our horrible changes that we've created to natural cycles like the nitrogen cycle. We've altered the nitrogen cycle through the addition of sewage, pollution in our wastewater from our agricultural runoff. This is really one of the major issues that I focus on in my research at the University of Hong Kong. What does that mean for reefs? Well, this is what we all think about when we imagine a coral reef. I dream about places like this. This is a coral reef in the South Pacific on an island called Chuuk in Micronesia. And what you notice about this beautiful image is that the water is very clear. There is no nutrients in the water. There's nothing for plankton to grow on. And there's an entire coral kingdom. It's a city of corals that are living there on the seafloor, hosting abundant marine life. And these types of habitats, they sustain an incredible economy, more than 30 billion US dollars per year. Unfortunately, though, 80% of the reefs on our planet are gone, and maybe even more than that. These are shocking statistics, and we hear them all the time. Yes, it's true that some places have reefs that are growing and emerging and are new, but the net loss of reefs is something that we should all be concerned about. And for those of you at home who are diving enthusiasts, you can share some of that concern with your non-diver friends. Tell them that this is something that's important. And we need only look to the west, to the Caribbean, to see what happens when we do not pay attention to these major problems. So I call this lessons from the West, because in the Caribbean we have a very similar situation to this part of the world, where we have a lot of different stakeholders who have the responsibility of stewardship over their local marine resources. And unfortunately, economic gain, particularly agricultural development, as well as the rise of a tourism economy has really devastated the coral reefs of the Caribbean. And we can see this in this old figure from 2003. This was 20 years ago, which shows on the y-axis there, we're looking at coral cover, the percentage of living corals that's covering the seabed. And in the Caribbean, in the 1970s, we had a very high coral cover, approaching 60%. That's a lot of coral. And over time, through a number of different stressors, including diseases, the loss of sea urchins, strong storms, and then increasing incidences of coral bleaching due to climate change, reefs in the Caribbean now are hovering at around 5% or less. So we've really seen what I would call the defaunation or the de-wilding of Caribbean coral reefs. And to put this into context, here's a picture from the 1980s showing a snorkeler on a reef in the Florida Keys. There is nothing like this anymore. In my whole career, I never got to see this. I only swam over the dead skeletal fragments that were left from this reef when it collapsed. And this pattern was repeated in every location, perhaps at different times, but the pattern was consistent, and it didn't stop. And now the reefs of the Caribbean have been changed forever. This was as a shocking picture also from the Florida Keys in the 1960s. So here's a family who has gone out fishing for the day, charter fishing. And what you can see behind them, hanging on hooks, are a number of giant grouper, which later became so overfished that it was declared an endangered species. Today, grouper are protected and they're recovering. In fact, they're recovering so well that fishermen are complaining that they eat too many of the fish that they're trying to catch. So there is cause for hope. But ultimately, the reefs of the Caribbean have been flattened. They went from being these incredible forests under the sea that supported so much other marine life to just being a desolate, barren seascape that's occupied by very different organisms. Things like shellfish, marine sponges, and soft corals or gorgonians. And these species are interesting and they contribute to biodiversity, but they're not the same with respect to building those underwater cities that corals are so good at. We've also completely de-wilded the water column. We've taken all the fish out. So today, this is an image of the fisheries catch from a charter fishing boat in the same place in recent years. And all of these fish are juveniles, juvenile representatives of their species. So we are fishing down the food web and we are removing those natural resources faster than they can replenish themselves. So we can learn a lot about how to reverse these problems through the study of conservation biology. And in some ways, Reef Check Hong Kong is a very targeted public outreach exercise to teach you all and get you all involved in citizen science to learn more about these issues. E.O. Wilson, who is a famed conservation biologist, taught us that there are several major threats to biodiversity, including habitat destruction, invasive species, pollution, the overpopulation of humanity, and overharvesting. And all of these issues are things that we have experienced right here in Hong Kong over time. Once again, in the Caribbean, there are examples of pollution having terrible consequences on coral reefs. This is a sewage outfall that's producing collectively about 50 million gallons, so about 3 liters per gallon, 150,000 or 1.5 billion liters, I have to do the conversion, of partially treated sewage into the coast of Florida every day from the city of Miami. Wastewater management is a terribly difficult issue for urban municipalities to deal with. On the right-hand side, you can see a nearby reef that has been completely consumed by algae. The nutrients have fueled the growth of that algae to the point that they have covered, grown over, and smothered and killed the reef. But linking these two issues together is incredibly challenging and something that I've dedicated my career to. So in my early research, I was focused on this change, how we change the use of the landscape and start affecting what's happening in the sea. I worked a lot in Mexico to try to understand how tourism there, one of the most rapidly growing places on Earth next to the Greater Bay Area here, which has been completely converted. All the natural landscape has been converted to hotels and restaurants with very minimal consideration for the waste that is generated from those activities. And a lot of my work was trying to find correlations between different types of measurements that we can make as a scientist to the number of tourists in the ocean. And one of my greatest achievements was finding a way to even estimate the number of tourists that are occupying nearby reef areas to reveal their footprint on the reef itself. We were really concerned about nutrient pollution, and this figure is a little bit shifted, but you can see that many scientists study pollution. We expose corals to different levels of pollution, and we watch what happens, as scientists do. And what you can see in this figure is that when you add nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen that come from our household detergents, from our toilets, from our wastewater systems, these nutrients have negative impacts on corals. It changes their coloration. It makes them sick. It makes them bleach. And even in places like Chuuk, which I showed you earlier, these beautiful places, if you swim near shore where people are living, you can see the same impacts. So it doesn't matter if you're in the South Pacific or if you're on the coast of China. The same issues are affecting corals in all places all over the world. But climate change is certainly what's going to be a major concern for coral reefs in the future. It already is. Here are some maps showing the Great Barrier Reef in recent years. I think this was in 2016, showing that how in the northern reaches of the Great Barrier Reef, closest to the equator, where it's the hottest, suffer very severe coral bleaching events. In 1 year, 30% loss of the Great Barrier Reef, and the following year, in 2017, there was a very similar severe event. So Australia is going to be suffering from repeat coral bleaching events that will likely wipe out most of the reefs in the northern areas. However, you can see there barely that in the south, they have very low mortality because corals might be able to migrate out of the equator, migrate towards the poles to cooler waters where they might persist. And John Pandolfi, in a paper in Science in 2005, he described this as a slippery slope to slime. And what that means is that we've taken these beautiful, intact marine ecosystems that you can see on the left-hand side, filled with megafauna, the things that you like to photograph in the water, beautiful coral communities. And we have we've taken out the fish, we've polluted the water, and we're pushing these ecosystems to something very different. Still filled with life, but different kinds of life. Different species of corals that do not build complex habitats. We, in the absence of fish, we get blooms of things like algae and jellyfish. Interesting organisms, but ones that we're not accustomed to enjoying in the same way we are those marine communities on the left. And here, as I've said, we have all of the factors that you might imagine. So as a scientist, Hong Kong is a really remarkable place to study because for more than a century, we have had to deal with all of these problems, and yet there are still many types of corals here, upwards of 90 species, and often forming beautiful and diverse coral communities, despite being in an area that is really, we're in the drainage for a parcel of land that contains 100 million people or more. And this is what some of our coral communities look like. You know this already because you want to go out there and look at them. Our corals are growing on bedrock mostly. They're not growing on the remnants of other corals, which is why we call them a coral community and not a coral reef. But nevertheless, despite that difference in terminology, they are remarkably diverse and beautiful habitats and something that's worth preserving. But I often think about what things were like in the past, and lately I've been calling upon photographers, divers, people that used to live in Hong Kong many years ago, and I've been trying to find materials to help me get a glimpse of the past, much like those pictures you saw from the Caribbean in the early part of the slides. So here's some images of Hong Kong in the 1990s. And yeah, even then we had quite a lot of coral, and we had a lot of diversity on those reefs. But there's something about these images that makes you want to go there. The apparent health of the corals is quite high. The diversity is quite high. There are even some images of corals here that we might not see anymore. There are also examples of schools of fish, even some things that might get you excited if you saw them while diving. And all of that changed dramatically in the 1990s, particularly during a time when Hong Kong was rapidly developing. So we saw a dramatic increase in our local population. We also undertook incredible engineering projects, namely to reclaim Victoria Harbor, and that's what these dredging ships are doing in this image. They're taking up sediments from Mears Bay to fill in what is today the harborfront. And so these types of reclamation activities were very stressful for marine communities, producing a lot of sedimentation and also releasing tremendous amounts of nutrients that were locked away in those sediments. So this was a really difficult time, and we wonder what were the impacts on our corals. And to fully understand that, we have to go even further back in time to think about what we have lost. And this is an old image of Hong Kong, I think from the late 1800s. And around that time, there was an American naturalist who was sailing throughout the Pacific, collecting samples of wildlife for a collection that would later become the foundation for the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And this gentleman, William Stimson, once sailed into Victoria Harbor and observed just outside of a place that he called Coral Bay, a high diversity of corals growing on the rocks, much like how we would describe things today. In 1854. And Stimson was a remarkable cartographer. He made a map of Victoria Harbor, and you can see where Coral Bay is located, especially if we overlay a Google Earth satellite image. His map making was remarkable. And Coral Bay is actually what is today Taiwan. So the ecosystem that Stimson was looking at is long gone because it's been covered with fill from reclamation. But it gives us an idea that the harbor was once a remarkable place, also with coral communities like the ones that we are now familiar with in eastern waters. Development does have a negative impact on corals, but Hong Kong now is heavily developed. So it helps us to have this historical context to think now, through innovative ways, what might we be able to get back. If we look at another example, this is an interesting story about a village house in Cheung Chau that was being renovated. And the Antiquities and Monuments Office was involved in doing an archaeological dig under the house, which is required by law. And I got a phone call. They asked me to come by and take a look at some of these coral fragments that they had dug up from below the house, because the house was built on what used to be the beach. And in the deepest parts of these sediment layers, we saw quite a lot of coral fragments, large boulders of corals, some branching species, and a lot of marine invertebrate shells that are affiliated with such coral reefs. So this looked like a very healthy community, and this was at Cheung Chau. And in the earlier sediment layers, so if we're going forward in time, we find that there's a change. We can see it in the sediment layers. We can see that the corals are becoming smaller, there are fewer branching species, and there are more different types of bivalves, some of which are common to river ecosystems. And in the uppermost layer, we see almost no corals and only bivalves and only species that are found from estuarine environments from the Pearl River. And above that, it was nothing but sediment, sand, pebbles, rocks, things that came from our activities. And recently we've been doing we've been dating material from excavations like this, and we know that this transition really started nearly 3,000 years ago and might have been linked to widespread land use change in Guangdong province as the province scaled up it's rice agriculture. So our coral reefs are affected by everything that happens in the region, not just within Hong Kong. And that those effects happened, and they started happening thousands of years ago, not just in the 1990s. We can see the cumulative impact on these things by digging into the sand. So this is some data looking at subtidal push coring. We hammer a pipe into the seabed and then pull it out and see what's inside. And in the deepest layers, in the oldest layers, we find that the sediments at times have up to 50% fragments of coral. That means there was so much coral that the coral fragments were coming off naturally and contributing to the marine sediment. But in recent years, in the upper core, we find that the number of coral fragments decreases dramatically. Many types of marine invertebrates have stayed the same over that time. The abundance of shells from snails and bivalves is largely unchanged, but the amount of terrestrial sediments, sand and gravel, has increased dramatically, and that's an evidence of our own human development. We can look at the effect of this change over time, and this is a paper that will soon be published in the journal Science Advances by my student John. And John was comparing data that actually we received from James in a collaboration with Baptist University. We compared historical data with modern data from push coring, and we found that in eastern waters, where we now value those coral communities and we dive on them a lot, we found that there hasn't been a whole lot of change. The number of coral genera, the number of species of different corals, is largely unchanged between the far past and the present. But if we look at southern Hong Kong, and this includes the southern parts of Hong Kong Island and Lama Island and Chung Chau, those islands in Lama Channel, we see that there's been a big change. We've lost about 9 different genera of corals. So something happened, something changed in the environment that made it less suitable for corals to survive. And the consequences of this are stark, because when you lose species of corals, you lose the shape of the reef that they provide. And so these are data showing all of the different genera of corals and from the past. And what we see from this figure is that all the way on the left, the presence of staghorn acropora, so the ones that look like antlers on a deer, their proportional abundance in the past was incredibly high, more than 50% across Hong Kong. More than 50% of the coral fragments were these staghorn corals. But in more modern times, these are our branching species, and these are our massive species. In modern times, we've seen a shift. So the gray bars there show the composition of genera in modern times. And we can see that we've lost all of those branching species, but we've gained, actually, a number of massive species. So the reef has certainly shifted from one type of coral to another, and we know that this is in response to changing environmental conditions. We've also gone around and we've collected coral fragments from beaches. And the next time you're visiting a beach, once they reopen, I encourage you to grab a handful of sand and look inside and see if you can find evidence of coral fragments. These are corals from the past. We've done that for staghorn corals in Hong Kong. And in this figure, you can see everywhere that we've looked for them. The white dots are places where we found their skeletons. So they used to be near those beaches and near those diving areas. And in the red dots, those are places where we visited and we found living staghorn corals. And by merging these data together, we can see that development around the Pearl River, around Victoria Harbor and Lama Channel has really changed the conditions that favor these staghorn corals and push them away from human areas. Even in Tolo Harbor, we see that change. There used to be staghorn corals all the way inside almost to Sha Tin, but now you can't find them until you reach Tolo Channel. So this is a concern, of course, but there's signs of hope. Look at Sai Kung. Look at Port Shelter. Here, today, we still have corals living close to human development. But how that development is sustainable and how that equilibrium is reached is something that we'll continue to investigate. Today, corals are undergoing more changes, and we've unfortunately seen an increase in things like bioerosion, and we are seeing increasing evidence of coral bleaching. Now, this is natural. These are natural processes that are accelerated by human disturbances like pollution and climate change. The issue with bioerosion is that although the coral itself might be healthy, the interior structure of it has been carved away by a number of organisms that are looking for something to eat. Things like sea urchins that graze the coral skeleton in search of algae, certain types of snails that are seeking something to eat from within the coral skeleton, and also bacteria that are fueled by nutrients from our wastewater and are trying to carve out pieces of the coral skeleton through their activities. Now, while this is a natural process, although accelerated by human activities, the end consequence for the coral is typically not good. During a strong storm, weakened corals tend to topple over, and once they fall into the sand and the sediment, they can die. We also have a continuing problem with marine debris, particularly ghost nets. And it's been really encouraging to see an AFCD working with a number of different organizations to tackle this serious problem as well. And even James here has done some really good work looking at coral bleaching, documenting really, I think, what was one of the first scientific studies of coral bleaching in Hong Kong. And even here, there's some cause for optimism, because even though researchers took these photos of coral bleaching after a severe warming event, almost all of these corals recovered very, very quickly. So Hong Kong, as a consequence of having hundreds, if not thousands of years of coexistence with human activities, has developed a very strong resilience in the face of our activities. And now, today that we have an enhanced understanding of what those problems are, we can start to think about solutions for improving the situation further. And the time to do that is now. Because with climate change, we expect that this part of the world will be warmer and wetter. We know that these are data from the Hong Kong Observatory going back to the 1800s. So there's been a remarkable increase in the water temperature and the air temperature, and there's been a remarkable increase in the amount of precipitation we get. So that means there's more runoff, there's more stormwater drainage, and all of these things will have to be mitigated in our future city and our planning. And that's why we've been really happy to work with AFCD on a number of exciting projects that deal with coral restoration. And I credit my students always for convincing me that this is a viable solution for a place like Hong Kong. Here are some images that show you the progression of coral growth, where we reintroduced staghorn corals to places within Tolo Channel where we didn't have them before. And we can see that there's a remarkable growth to 13 months. We saw that these corals grew more than 1,000%. And this performance is due directly to effective management practices and enhanced wastewater treatment. Our water quality is indeed improving. And many of you probably enjoyed a lot of good diving this year. The water clarity continues to improve. We see fisheries recovering after the trawling ban. So there's a lot to be hopeful for, and we need you to be supporters and advocates for these good works. We need to support AFCD and other government departments and give them credit for the positive things that have happened. In addition to AFCD, the Harbor Area Treatment Scheme, that was a multi-agency initiative, as well as the trawling ban, are two pieces of legislation that I tell my international colleagues are probably some of the most impactful conservation achievements in the last decade internationally. So there are a lot of reasons to be optimistic about corals, despite their shaky history.
接住落嚟咧，就會係我哋嘅問答環節啦。不如我問下 Dr. Baker 一啲問題先啦。Personally, I have your talk was really interesting, and I really learned a lot from it. So about the slide that you mentioned that Hong Kong is getting warmer, and there's going to be more rainfall. So how do you think that would affect the biodiversity of corals in Hong Kong, would it shift towards like more like the tropical regions? Would we have more species influxing into Hong Kong, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an exciting possibility. In fact, I feel so strongly about that. I'd love to talk to you about working with mainland authorities about bringing corals from Hainan and other tropical parts of China to Hong Kong, because we might be the only place in the world aside from Australia that can do that through the unified governance that we have here. We have the opportunity to accelerate the range expansion of some species by physically moving them. And I think that there's some justification for this because we're all one continuous coastline. So naturally, we think that these are connected populations. We just need to give them a chance to relocate here. So warming is going to affect Hong Kong. It's going to, in the long term, maybe in my lifetime, we might start to see a few new species that we haven't seen in quite some time showing up. What worries me more is that the rainfall is going to increase. That means more discharge from the Pearl River. It means more severe storms. It means that there's going to be more urban runoff from our city. And I'm encouraged to know that, for example, the EPD and the Drainage Services Department, they're aware of this. They know this is happening. And I think a lot of attention now is being given to stormwater quality and how that runoff could be mitigated or managed in some ways. I also think that we need to start thinking about wetland enhancement, restoring mangrove forests, oyster reefs, things that will protect the city from storm surge, from flooding, and from other natural disasters that we will anticipate should increase in the future. So there are negatives for sure, but there are also some positives. We might see more diversity, but we have to make sure that we are good stewards of the environment and create an opportunity for those organisms to thrive.
另外一位朋友都有問題嘅，咁我可能就由Dr. Baker 去回答啦。So Dr. Baker, so currently someone has a question about whether there are coral communities present in the southern Hong Kong islands. So you're an expert in this area, so I would like to have your insights, please.
Yeah, along the southern coast of Hong Kong Island, I think is another place where we might anticipate seeing some interesting things in the coming years, right? With climate change, with enhanced wastewater treatment. For example, at Stanley Main Beach, there was a sewage outfall that was operating, and now that has been turned off. So there are a lot of things that are happening in the government with respect to management of water quality and improved wastewater management that a lot of times the public doesn't know that these things are happening. I don't think anyone knew in Stanley that they switched off the sewage. That's a very positive thing that we should all be celebrating. And so, my job is to help work with government to document the recovery of some of these habitats that we have. And, we know, again, from a historical perspective that around Stanley and Tai Tam Bay, for example, there are there's evidence of coral communities that used to be there. And so it's not a stretch of the imagination to think that with the enhanced management measures, with active restoration, even with reef checks, corals of opportunity, rescuing corals of opportunity, all of these things can collectively contribute to enhancing the marine ecosystem as a whole. And we know that these corals are important foundational species. So every single one of them that we give a second chance to is going to be one individual that might later grow and reproduce and create more corals for Hong Kong. And that's a very positive thing. So yes, lots of things going on the southern coast. Keep your eyes open and let us know what you see.
So, Dr. Baker, I have a personal question for you. So, in your PowerPoint, you talked about there was a community shift of staghorn corals, so branching corals into massive and submassive corals. Can you give us some insight? What do you think caused this transformation? Like, what advantages did staghorn corals have before, and what massive corals have now that caused them to dominate the communities?
Great question. Yeah, all over the world, in historically we saw the dominance of staghorn corals. Staghorn corals are beautiful, and we tend to think of them when we think of healthy coral reefs. But in fact, staghorn corals are more like weeds, and not in a bad way, but they're very competitive on coral reefs that have a certain environmental quality. When the water is very clear, very warm, they grow very quickly. In the tropics, they can grow 10 centimeters to 30 centimeters per year. Incredible rates of growth. And because they're concentrating that growth, growing like this in this branching formation, they can cover a large area very quickly. And in fact, they can cover other corals quickly. They can shade them so that those corals don't get to see the sun. So that's a competitive advantage that these staghorn corals have in extremely clean, warm environments that we see in many places close to the equator. But nowadays, with human transformations of the marine environment, we have more sediment in the water. We have more nutrients in the water. And these types of conditions don't favor staghorn corals. If you throw sediment on a staghorn coral, it's abrasive. It damages the tissues. The coral can die. If you pollute the water and make it darker, there's not enough light for the staghorn coral to grow. It's more like a plant, really, than an animal. But then when you look at these other corals that are doing better in recent times, the massive and submassive species, they have incredible adaptations to some of these stressors. For example, the platygyra, if you put sediment on top of it, it inflates itself like a balloon and then gets rid of the sand and then goes about its day. A staghorn coral can't do that. So there are certain biological adaptations that allow massive corals to thrive in somewhat disturbed environments, but they're very slow growing, very, very slow growing, and it's unlikely that in our lifetime we would see dramatic change in those coral communities. Whereas if we had more staghorn corals, we might see a rapid expansion of coral communities as well as new habitat for other marine life. So as we talk about coral restoration, a lot of efforts globally focus exclusively on staghorn corals. Our projects aim to incorporate staghorn corals, but also recognize that other species are actually better adapted for our local environment. So we're playing a trade-off between speed and resilience.
So is that why the reason for your coral restoration project, I saw that Rico mentioned that you have multiple species. So are you trying to test it out, like which one is the most suitable candidate for restoration in Hong Kong?
That's right. One fact you might not know is that staghorn corals hadn't been seen in Hoi Ha Wan since 2004. And thanks to AFCD's support and the Marine Parks Council approval, we reintroduced them to the Marine Park for the first time just a few years ago. And they're doing great. So you give them a chance to recolonize the place where they used to live and keep the conditions good, they will do very well. So, but we have to be mindful of the fact that climate change, that development, these things are going to affect our staghorn corals. They're going to stress them out, and we might see some mortality. So if you want to hedge your bets, if you're a good investor, you don't put all your investments in one account or in one stock, but you diversify your portfolio. We're doing the same. We're diversifying, and we're identifying other species that may be better adapted under different conditions. And those conditions are difficult to predict for the future. So therefore, we're hedging our bets.
I see. Thank you very much for your answers.